So I want to start by just framing things with some bigger picture stuff. To begin with, let's think about our senses. From birth until death, this is the only information we have about the world out there. Right? We get everything through these channels, like our eyes and ears, and from that we deduce everything else we know about the world. So what are the channels? What are the senses that we humans have? It's probably easy for you to list off the 5 famous senses that Aristotle articulated 2,000 years ago. So sight and sound, taste and smell, and of course touch. But we can't actually stop there. As we'll see throughout this course, we have way more than the traditional simple 5 senses. So there are lots of other things we can detect about the world or even about our own internal state that'll be relevant to sensation and perception. So for example, we can sense heat and cold and muscle tension within our bodies. We can also sense gravity and acceleration. We have a sense of balance. We can certainly tell if we've stubbed our toe or have a stomach ache. We can feel thirst and hunger. We can have a sensation that we can't breathe, that we need oxygen. We can feel when we're blushing. Certainly know when you need to pee or when you're having an orgasm. We can feel a sense of floating or connectedness with the world, maybe depending on what drugs you've done recently or whether you're meditating. We can feel an out-of-body experience and many more things. So we'll explore most of these throughout the course. But first, let's just think about why sensation and perception is such a fundamental field of psychology. So I want to start by thinking about how does sensation and perception relate to or overlap with some other areas of psychology where we'll see that it's highly relevant. For example, a clinical psychologist might ask questions like, why can't a patient with schizophrenia distinguish hallucinations from reality? That's the kind of thing that S&P psychologists study. Or a developmental psychologist might ask, can babies recognize their parents' voice at birth? Or how do we pick up language when we hear it spoken by our parents and caretakers and those around us? Those questions studied by sensation and perception psychologists. Or an evolutionary psychologist or social psychologist might be interested in mating and maybe what role does smell play in finding or keeping a mate? Sensation and perception psychologists can help answer that question. A sports psychologist might ask questions like, why does the hole on a golf green actually look bigger when you're playing well? Or a neuropsychologist might ask questions like, what brain area is likely damaged in someone who's showing a certain functional impairment, like losing the ability to speak? But even outside of traditional psychology, sensation and perception is still relevant. So there's lots of other areas where sensation perception relates to or overlaps with fields outside of psychology. For example, biologists often ask questions like about the sensory systems of animals. What senses do animals have that humans lack? Like sharks have magnetoreception, electroreception. They're called elasma branches. They can detect things that we can't. Sensation perception psychologists often study that from a comparative perspective or to help figure out new things to design for human products. And that brings us to engineers who certainly work with sensation and perception psychologists. So an engineer might ask something like, how do we design a prosthetic arm that can actually feel touch? It's much easier to design a prosthetic that you can get motor control over. You can make it do things that you want, but actually getting the brain to give an experience of I'm feeling things when I touch it. Or further than that, maybe even feeling that the arm is part of my body. That's the kind of thing a sensation and perception psychologist studies. And of course, there are philosophers out there who are interested in questions of consciousness. What is consciousness? Or how do first-person experiences arise from neurons firing? And that is something that sensation and perception psychologists have studied historically. In a more applied sense, of something like a food scientist might ask, how can our company create a protein bar that tastes good without a lot of sugar? And that's the kind of thing sensation and perception can answer. In fact, a lot of people who get their doctorate or master's in sensation and perception psychology end up going into applied fields like this. Or a pharmaceutical researcher might ask questions like, does this treatment for macular degeneration work in an animal model? And the way they answer that is with methods of sensation and perception to detect and figure out what is it that this mouse or rat is seeing, how well are its eyes working. We use sensation and perception methods to study that. So now, why is the field called sensation and perception? Because usually we think of these words as meaning roughly the same thing, right? Colloquially, these are synonymous. But from a scientific perspective, in the scientific field of psychology, these have often been distinguished as two separate things. They're related, they're importantly connected, but we might say sensation is kind of an earlier step in a bigger process. Sensation, you could say, is the first step of when we detect something about the outer world out there. So sensation you could define as the stimulation of sensory neurons. So these are little detectors that we have in our eye, in our ear, in our skin, right? So the stimulation of these detectors, these sensory neurons, by a physical stimulus, like light waves and sound waves and things like that. So for example, light waves of a particular wavelength, like 650 nanometers, might hit the back of our eye, where what we call the retina is just a layer of these sensory neurons, right? And when that light hits them, it causes those sensory neurons in the eye to fire, which sends a neural signal to the brain, an electrochemical signal to the brain, so we can process that information and then make sense of what we're seeing. Well, this first step is just turning on some neurons, but we have not yet actually seen anything, in the sense of we haven't yet, at this early stage of the process, had any experience. We don't recognize that there's a flower there. We certainly can't put a word to it, and we can't act based on it. At this point, the light has just hit us and done something to some sort of automated processes in our body, but we're not seeing anything at this stage of this early stage of what we might call sensation. So sensation, you could say, is what happens where the outside world first meets your body, specifically meets these sensory neurons, these detectors we have for certain types of physical input or physical signals. Okay? And then what is perception? Perception you could think of as something that has to happen after that. Perception is the interpretation of those sensory neural signals as an experience after it gets processed in the brain. So really it's this larger process that we're talking about usually when we talk about perception. Think of it this way. If there's a round blob of red in front of me, right, a certain circular shape, and my red detector neurons in my eye have gone off, okay, I've registered something about the shape and the color, but that hasn't yet reached the point where I experience anything. And by the time I actually experience and quote unquote see the thing in front of me, my brain has already done so much processing that I don't see it as a blob of red, right? My experience from the start is I recognize this as a ball. I'm seeing a ball. I'm having a conscious experience of a ball. And maybe like, oh shit, it's a ball that's approaching me, getting bigger and bigger. It's faster. Like I need to dodge, or I need to catch the ball. I need to act in a certain way. I need to use that information. So perception is the interpretation of that info that came into the brain after a lot of work has been done. And that work takes time, right? Tens of milliseconds, sometimes hundreds of milliseconds. So fractions of a second between when the information hits our detectors and when we actually make sense of it and have an experience. Now, perception, as we'll see, is affected during all this processing. It's affected then by our past experience, our knowledge, our expectations. Just to give you a quick example, we don't experience our friends as shrinking when they walk away from us, even though the physical sensory input from the light waves that's bouncing off of them and hitting our eye is getting smaller. It's taking up less of our visual field, it's hitting less of our retina, but that doesn't mean that our interpretation or our experience of it is them getting smaller, even though the light coming off of them got smaller. Why? Because that's not how our brain processes that information. So perception is what we're most fundamentally interested in psychology, but we have to understand the sensation as one important step of that. Now, we'll soon see that there's not such a clear distinction between S and P, sensation and perception, but for now, this distinction gives us a really good starting point. But modern researchers usually just speak about perception as a process. So it's a process that starts with sensory neurons, and we don't necessarily use the term sensation by itself very much. So speaking of this perceptual process, what is it? Let's dive in. This is one depiction of the perceptual process, the different steps in that. So you could start with there's something out there in the world, this first step, the stimulus in the environment. So that's an actual tree or something out there. And in the case of vision, so we'll start with just kind of looking at sight, the sense of sight. What happens is light from, say, the sun bounces off that tree and eventually hits our eyes. It enters our eyes and hits some sort of detector at the back of our eyes. So part of this process, there's a thing out there, but then this light has to travel, and in this case, go through the environment, but also go through, our cornea, our lens, and our eye before it eventually hits the detectors, what I've called the sensory neurons, or we might call them sensory receptors because they receive information. And we'll see that there are some processes that go on even early on when those sensory detectors, those sensory neurons, catch that light or other information from the world. So we'll dive into some of those processes, some of the early information processing that goes on. And then there's a whole bunch of neural processing that happens. Usually when we talk about that, we mean processing that happens in the brain, although we'll see some of it can happen outside of the brain, and even with simple things like reflex arcs. Sometimes it doesn't even have to go to the brain before we can act, but most of the things we're interested in as psychologists is processing that happens in the brain, right? And when we get there, then we've got these larger, more fundamental things like being able to recognize what something is, make sense of it. That's all part of the perceptual process. Some of it happens behind the scenes unconsciously, but at some point we might become aware of, I'm seeing something, or my attention is drawn to something, or I know what that is. And that then will guide, as this final step, the actions that we take in the world, right? To run away from the tiger, to dodge the ball, or to approach the food, or to change how we're moving our arms so the food actually hits our mouth instead of missing and hitting our cheek. That is all action. And of course, we can take action. If you look at this final arrow here, we can take action in order to gain more information. So we might move around the tree to see what's behind it and things like that. And then finally, there's this middle bit on this diagram here that we'll talk about at the end, which is knowledge goes into this process. So when we get to the actual interpretation that's happening in the brain, the use of those neural signals and all that neural processing, the past knowledge, past experiences, and things like that do come into play. So let's dive into the steps of the perceptual process. We'll go through each of these in turn kind of quickly, and then we'll see for all the senses and all the perceptual phenomena we study throughout the semester, we'll see this process come up over and over again. So I'll just put it up there in the corner so we can kind of follow along as we go. Let's start with the first couple bits here. So the stimulus out there in the environment, and some light gets reflected off of it and focused to hit the back of our eye, the retina. So what we could distinguish out here are two things. It's important to understand when we're talking about something that we see, there is the actual object out there in the world. Sometimes we call this the distal stimulus. That's the thing out there in the world, like the tree itself, the thing as it is. The tree is three-dimensional, right? The tree has certain depth and structure to it. But we don't actually stick the tree inside our eye and shove the whole frickin' tree up against our retina and then detect, and that turns the neurons on. No, what we actually get access to, what actually hits us, is light that bounced off the distal stimulus out there. So what we're actually getting, if you think about it, when the light bounces off the tree, comes through the atmosphere, goes through the front of our eye, when it actually hits the sensory neurons at the retina, at the back of our eye, what we're getting is light. And the light is a certain structure, a certain shape, but basically it's a two-dimensional projection of that angle that we happen to have on the tree, right? The side of the tree that we're looking at, that's what actually hits our detectors. We don't see the tree. We don't detect the tree. We detect one angle. We detect the light that bounced off of it. So that we might label, that thing, that the light waves that actually hit our eye back here, we might call that the proximal stimulus. So that's what actually hits our body's sensors. It's the light as it is when it hits the retina after bouncing off of the tree. To help you remember the distance between, or the difference between these two terms, it might help you to think of distal. Distal is kind of like distant, right? So it's the object out there that's distant from us. It's out there in the world. Whereas you might remember proximal stimulus as the stimulus that's in proximity to us. It's close. It's the one that actually hits us, the one that actually hits our detectors. That's the proximal stimulus. So it'll help to have this in mind, because the brain, when it processes all this information, the brain is only ever going to have access to the information that is in the proximal stimulus. We don't directly ever see the tree in the sense of the tree turning on our detectors. We only see the proximal stimulus, the light reflected off of the tree. And it turns out lots of factors affect the proximal stimulus. Some of these might be pretty obvious if you just think about it for a moment, like time of day will certainly affect the characteristics of the light that hits the tree, and thus it bounces off the tree and hits our eyes, which means we might perceive it as a lush green when it's at noon or a dull gray when it's at twilight. The proximal stimulus will be very different. That doesn't mean the tree is actually changing its fundamental constituency and moving from a greenness to a grayness. It's the proximal stimulus that's changing based on the time of day, based off the light that bounced off of it. Or the texture and shape of the tree itself, of course, affects what and how much light it reflects, but also atmospheric conditions affect the light between the tree and the eye. So if it's a foggy day or a rainy day or a snowy day, that will affect the proximal stimulus, the info that we detect, and so we will end up detecting and perceiving something very different than the tree as it is. We don't directly perceive the distal stimulus. And likewise, our eye anatomy, right? Our cornea and our lens in our eyes, that affects what light gets into the retina, how it's focused. In other words, it can make us see things more blurry if we happen to be short-sighted, right? Or less blurry if we happen to put on some artificial lenses in front of us. All of that affects the proximal stimulus and changes so that what hits our eyes might not be a totally accurate depiction of what's out there in the world. So what hits our eye is not actually a perfect image of reality. It's one version of it that might even have been twisted a little bit along the way. Now, when it does hit us, when the light, the proximal stimulus does hit our sensory neurons, our detectors, what it's really hitting is a special type of neuron, a nerve ending, so the end of a neuron that happens to have evolved to respond to certain environmental energy. And so these specialized neurons that have a nerve ending that responds to environmental energy, we sometimes call these sensory receptors. So a sensory receptor is just the special term for a sensory neuron, a type of neuron that receives sensory information about the world. When it comes to vision, this usually means rods and cones, two special types of neurons or cells at the back of our eye that fire when they get hit by light. They go off, they go pew, 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 little neurons sending signals to the brain when the correct type of light runs into them. In our skin, we have other types of sensory receptors, little discs and little things that go off when, say, mechanical pressure hits them or vibrations hit our skin. Those would all be sensory receptors that are then going to send signals to the brain. So it's the parts of your body that register external stimuli and turn those into neurons firing. In other words, they're cells that detect and respond to light or air pressure or touches on your skin or painful damage or chemical things like odorants when you smell something. All of those are sensory receptors. Now, what is it that a sensory receptor does? The process of turning that environmental energy into neural signals, we have a term for that. We call it transduction. So transduction is the conversion process, basically the turning on of those sensory detectors and sending neural signal to the brain. That's transduction. So now instead of light waves or sound waves, it's just a series of action potentials or neural firing in our nervous system. The light doesn't continue moving throughout your brain. There's not light waves bouncing around in your brain. Rather, it's neurons firing at this point. We've converted from one type of energy to a different type. So transduction, it's a process. We could say transduction is what sensory receptors do. So it's still that early stage in the process. We haven't actually experienced anything. We're not really seeing anything just because our rods and cones have gone off, but we will soon after if that information goes to the brain. So if the optic nerve isn't cut, then that info will get transmitted to the brain. And if you haven't had damage to the visual cortex, the visual part of your brain, then that information will get processed. And after a while, you will then experience something. You will see something. Okay, so the processing then. As we say, there's a couple steps along the way where we get receptors themselves doing some processing. So if you look at the left side of this image here, what we've got at the top are some rods and cones. So light has hit them and they've started firing their specialized neurons. So they start firing as neurons. They go pew, 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 and send the signals down. But in this case, in our retina and the rest of our eye, we have a lump of a bunch of other types of cells in a pretty complicated network that actually does quite a bit of information processing long before that info gets transmitted to the brain itself. So there's some early processing that happens, we could say in these receptor processes, but then a bunch of other processing, of course, is going to take place as we get further into the nervous system, and usually that means going directly to the brain. So we process that information, right? It's going to go through processing. They'll modify, reduce, or amplify the signals in a certain way, and those signals get propagated to various areas. Usually that means the occipital lobe of the brain, or the temporal lobe of the brain, or the parietal lobe of the brain, and so on. But as I mentioned before, it could also be directly sent to a motor neuron, as with reflexes, where we respond without too much further processing. But what we'll care about for the most part in this class is sensory input that goes to the brain. So it goes to a primary receiving area. For example, with vision, things that we see, info from our eyes goes through the optic nerve to the back of our brain, where we have something called the occipital lobe. And we'll go over all of that in this course. We'll get into the details later. I'm just giving a quick overview. Things that we hear, things from our ears, that goes into the temporal lobe. And then we have the experience of hearing it. Now, that top stuff in our whole perceptual process here, the top layer, the perception, the recognition, things like that, that has to have the brain. We have to have the brain in order to have conscious experience, to realize that I'm seeing something, and specifically to realize, oh, that's a tree that I'm seeing in front of me, that I've now made sense of that distal stimulus. I've now detected it in a way that I can do something, that I can act, that I can, say, have a closer look, right? So finally, the brain is doing more processing and eventually giving us that conscious experience, where we recognize, we categorize things, we act based on what we perceive. The key point here is this is a process that takes some time. It takes large fractions of a second between the transduction by sensory receptors and our experience of seeing or hearing something. Now, finally, I mentioned this middle part of the diagram in the perceptual process, an important caveat and an important thing that we'll come back to over and over throughout this course, that knowledge, and we might say things like past experience and context or other cues that are there in the environment, all of that affects what we perceive, even if we're talking about the proximal stimulus that hits our sensory receptors being the exact same. So the exact same stuff can hit your eyes, but depending on your past experience or the mood you're in or your knowledge, what you expect, depending on those things, the exact same thing hitting your eyes might lead to a very different perception or experience. So let's do a quick little at-home example. If you have a piece of paper, you might just do this, follow these instructions real quick. If not, you can kind of just do it in your head. But say I ask you as a task to copy down this series and write the thing that comes next. So most people can do this quickly and easily. In fact, we do this in laboratory tasks, and people have no problem going A, B, C, and then they'll write down the thing that comes next is D, obviously, right? That's very easy. But we might bring someone else into the laboratory and have them do a similar task, but this time we put this in front of them and say, copy down the series and write the thing that comes next. And people will usually write down in their own handwriting 12, 13, 14, and what comes next is 15. But you may have already noticed something about those two stimuli that I showed you, those two things that I showed you, which is the middle element in those series was the same in both cases. What we see in one context as a B, we might see in another context as a 13. Even though it's the same proximal stimulus hitting our retina, the same information landing on our eyes, it has the same lines and squiggles, but in one context you perceive it as a B, in another context you perceive it as a 13. That's more about the contextual information, the past knowledge, even past knowledge of just what you saw above and below it, right? So another example, I'll give you an example of some, basically a simple test that was done a long time ago in the 60s in a laboratory. You can bring people into the lab and ask them, okay, I'm going to put some pictures in front of you. For each picture, I want you to quickly write down what it is, or in this case, if you want to play along at home, write it down if you have a piece of paper. We'll go pretty fast, so one word is fine. But if you want to play along, you could also just say it out loud. So I'm going to show you some pictures. They're going to go really fast, just a handful of them. But each time I want you to just write down or say what the word for that thing is. Just one word. Here we go. So write down what that is, or say what that is. Okay? 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 Okay. And then I might ask, what was that fifth image of? So what did you write down? What did you say out loud? Or again, if we bring a lot of people into the laboratory here, because of course people might use different words, don't worry too much about exactly what you said or what you wrote down. But most people, when we ask them after presenting us the first parts of those series, those 4 animals, most people, when they see that 5th image, they will say a mouse or a rat or a rodent, something like that is common. So you can see sort of the ears of the mouse up here. You can see the tail wrapping around. Here's the front of its face and its little eye right there. So a lot of people they perceive a mouse or a rat after being primed by seeing some other animals. But we can do that same task with different people, bring different people into the lab, a different set of people, and have them go through the same kind of task, but we show them pictures like this. So we have them write down a single word for what they see. So they might see this and write down something like woman or girl. Similar here, or maybe they got some other word for it. Maybe man or boy here or something like that, I don't know. Whatever the word is, but some pictures of people. And then we show them that 5th image. And again, in this case, they look at it for just the same amount of time, same thing. And yet people, if they've been primed by seeing some people's faces, they will often say that what they saw in that 5th picture, what they saw is a man. Often they'll say old man or something like that. So going back to it, what are we talking about when we say man? Well, imagine what we've got here is kind of a long protuberant nose. Here's his eyes or maybe some glasses that he's wearing, right? There's his nose. This is his ear back here. And down here would be his chin, right? And if you look at it that way, you can maybe kind of see, oh, I see, maybe even your perception starts to go back and forth. I can see an old man, but I can kind of see a mouse. I can see an old man. I can see a mouse. There's other famous illusions, even better than this one, like a rabbit and duck, where it's easy to switch back and forth between seeing it both ways. We'll talk about illusions like that this semester. But the point is, in a laboratory test, the fact that people look at the exact same proximal stimulus, the same image, and yet perceive something different, that we get a very different set of answers depending on what they've seen previously, the sort of contextual or surrounding information, the context or past experience, that tells us that what we perceive isn't just a simple bottom-up process of what hit our sensory receptors. What we perceive is taking into account that knowledge, past experience, and so on. Another good example of this, or more famous, simple example, would be this, the cat, as drawn here. Most people see it, the middle here as an H, or the middle here as an A, even though it's the exact same proximal stimulus. The context makes our brain easily see it as something else, especially if you don't see them side by side. It's not as obvious. If I was just writing things out and wrote it out, early in a document and late in a document, you might not notice that the same thing had shown up twice, but was interpreted very differently. Another famous example from a study, there's this figure here, and you ask people, what is it that you're seeing? And often people will say, oh, it's an old man face or something like that. And then you show them a slightly degraded image, slightly changed image. They'll still see the old man, It looks like maybe he's getting grumpy or starting to get a little drunk, right? The old man is changing, is starting to look really weird. By the time we get about here in the series, people will often start saying, oh, it looks like something else now. Maybe even it starts to look like a woman on her knees crying or something like that. Most people will say they see a man's face for most of the series until we get towards the end. Usually towards the end of the series, it starts to look like something else. But if we show the same series in reverse, where the first thing they see is this image at the end, people will often say, oh, it looks like a woman crying on her knees, something like that. If we show it in reverse order, then they'll continue to see a woman on her knees crying, even all the way until we get pretty late in the series before it starts to look like something else and people start saying, oh, now I see a man's face. So these middle ones, right, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th here, what we see, what we perceive of them isn't just coming from the proximal stimulus, what's hitting our eyes. It's coming from what we've seen recently or the kind of mental set that our brain was stuck with from our previous experience a moment ago. This is a famous piece of artwork by the Swiss artist Sandro Del Prete, who painted this. And I might ask, what do you see when you look at this? And the answers are pretty interesting. When people look at this, they'll often say something like, oh, I see maybe a man and a woman. And, someone, if you show it to little kids will not necessarily see the man and the woman. In fact, children, when they look at this, they see a bunch of little dolphins on the bottle. And maybe that's what you saw, right? So a lot of adults, when they see this, will see a man and a woman embracing. That's sort of the white part of the image in the middle there. But if you look closer, you'll see that the image of the man and the woman is actually made up of a bunch of dolphins. So here in the sort of darker part, there is the beak of a dolphin with its mouth kind of open. There's its eye. Here's a fin at the back, a dorsal fin. Here's its tail. Here's another dolphin over here. Here's a dolphin's tail and going down to the tip of the dolphin. And so you actually see the image, what you maybe saw initially is different than what someone else will see. Because little children, right, they've maybe been exposed to different stimuli. They will more quickly pick up and more likely to pick up the dolphins in this image than something else. What we perceive, what our brain sees, depends on all the experiences and stimuli you've been exposed to in your life previously. So, big picture here, the takeaway from this, everything we perceive is not direct contact with the world. We don't directly perceive the world. Rather, our perception, what we experience, what we see and hear, is actually a representation. You might even say a simulation or our brain's best guess, but it's constructed by the brain. We receive incomplete and inaccurate proximal stimuli, only some of which our sensory receptors can pick up and transduce, at which point that signal is modified before it even reaches the brain, and then it gets heavily processed in the brain and heavily affected by our past experience and knowledge and all of that. So fundamentally, you might say, I like to come back to this quote from Kant, we see things not as they are, but as we are. In other words, our perception, it's not reality. But as we'll see this semester, it's close enough for survival.